Liam, how you going?
Hi, how are you?
Hey, so Liam, just establish your credentials. You're Liam Kavanagh. You're director of Life Itself organization. And what's your
Yeah.
background?
So I am a cognitive scientist by training. Also was an economist for a while. So I spent my 20s working as an economist around the world, applied economist in Tanzania and New York, among other places. But that got me really interested in like why do people believe in things like, the modern economic system? It's not because they make sense, it's because there's some other reasons. So I got interested in ideology. So my PhD is really in ideology, but then I've been applying that by starting up an organization which responds to a dawning ideological crisis. So people call it the poly crisis. So nowadays that's on the front page of the Financial Times. When we started Life Itself in 2016, no one had any idea what on earth we were on about, but in 7 short years, everybody knows what we're talking about. And I also recently founded the Moderate Flank, which is a climate movement that tries to get climate action outside of the progressive bubble.
Okay.
And it's talk to people, who aren't the usual suspects. And
Yeah.
it might be a conversation for another time.
Yeah, yeah. Happy to have that conversation. So I guess down to ideology and belief. I get the two things that I want to just tease out with you, and this goes back to our conversations in Bergerac in March, April last year, was this conversation about the spread of Christianity through Europe back in the day, which would have spread
Mm.
into pagan Europe. I want to talk about that, but I also just want to talk about Buddhism as well as a belief system, and where Buddhism fits into this sort of broader sort of ecological spirituality frame. So those two things over the next 25 minutes or so. So I've just been reading about the Battle of Ellis or Ellen or somewhere in Estonia, where the Christians basically came in and there was a big battle, and 2,000 pagans were killed and eventually came to surrender to the Christians and basically adopted Christianity. And we think of Christians as being sort of passive, gentle people, and Jesus being this like peaceful character, and yet the spread of Christianity uh, at certain times in history was not too peaceful at all. And the point that I wanted to make
Some
about,
people, the
huh?
Crusades. I said some people think of Christianity that way. Of course, there's the Crusades as well, right? Rather,
Yeah, yeah.
rather famous. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, this was a part of that whole program of like expanding Christendom through, the sword. Anyway, so the point that I wanted to make about that was you've got a pagan culture, which is and again, I'm just going to try and like make it simple, and it might be wrong, but at least it will be broadly get some themes right. Is the pagan cultures, which is this pre-Christian cultures, were very much nature-based, very forest-based, very river-based, very what we would refer to today as eco-spiritual or ecological spirituality. Whereas then along came the Christian culture, imposed in many instances by force, but not always, cultural, osmosis in many other cases as well. But this was a spiritual belief that was not connected to the forest. And so do you understand where you understand how then you end up with the spirituality manifests itself into the real world through the actions and inactions of the believer. So what can you say to that?
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot there. I think, yeah, I mean, I'm sort of to kind of bracket my background on this particular question. I'm really interested in making eco spirituality accessible again, and how do we kind of reconnect to that aspect of our spirituality, of having a spiritual relationship with nature. Yeah, and I think, well, I mean, first of all, there's something obviously deep in the Christian myth that kind of man is Lord over nature, is given by God the ability to, or the kind of responsibility to be the Lord of nature. So God is above us, and we're above the rest of the of nature, and that is in most interpretations of Christian mythology, at least the standard interpretation, the dominant one. That's the way people look at it. So I mean, generally, I think most people who have looked at um, compared religions, if you can say. I mean, religion itself is kind of a strange term. A lot of people from other parts of the world dispute that what they have is properly even called a religion, because we kind of look at it, other people's religions, as like what they have instead of Christianity, and we're kind of understanding them through the lens of Christianity, whereas that may not be their experience at all. They have a really hard time understanding Christianity in terms of what they do or know or feel. Right? A lot of my understanding of talking to people who are, say, animists or something like that. Back when I was working in Tanzania, I was they um, well, just the whole concept of Christianity sounded kind of foreign to them. They felt like there was a lot of the land and nature seemed very alive to them. They had a very direct and reverent experience of their surroundings, and kind of tend to engage with it in a different way that I think is probably very difficult for us to understand. And I think it's probably very difficult to understand when you have a belief system that says that you're kind of the lord of nature, which is not a mindset that I think is natural to humans,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember in our conversations back in Bergerac, we were talking about how many of the contemporary churches and cathedrals in Europe were located on what were probably pagan sacred sites. That there was this, not only was everybody, encouraged, either peacefully or not, to believe the new thing, but they subsumed also the many of the cultural practices and spaces that had been used by the previous inhabitants there. That's
yeah. I mean, that's true. I mean, it's basically, um, I mean, in some practices, I think we mentioned there's a practice called the Devil's Door, or a side entrance, where even after the establishment of many churches, people would enter in through the side door and do pagan rites in the church itself, because there was surviving strands of paganism. Yeah, and the churches in general were. I mean, as we know, I mean, kind of Christmas is not historic. Like Jesus Christ's birthday is not the winter solstice, right? I mean, the Christmas itself is basically an invention of like replacing winter solstice with a new holiday, which fits with the new kind of religion, right? But it's basically a replacement for the lowest point of the year in terms of sunlight, the kind of one end of the of the solar calendar, if you'd say, so and yeah, that's where what our what Christianity was built on, and I think there's a question of how to build on Christianity. I think is where that conversation entered. It's like, well, look, these are our spiritual sites, the churches of Europe. What will we do? What do we do in a time where there is some kind of innate spiritual impulse in humans, and there are places on earth where that's been expressed, and that what was natural to our converting pagan ancestors was to kind of like build the new church around on top of the old church, or near to the old kind of site. And then what do we do nowadays that we have these empty churches? Yeah,
Yes.
right.
Yeah, actually, I like your point that if you're going to subsume a culture with a new spiritual belief, the best place to build the temples of worship, for want of a better term, is on the old places of worship, right? The groves or whatever the places were, because two reasons. Firstly, people associate that place as a spiritual place. And secondly, once you build your infrastructure upon it, the old ones actually now disappeared. Whereas if you build your infrastructure somewhere else, then that place still remains. And if you actually wanted to snuff out a culture, you'd probably want to subsume its infrastructure, basically. You mentioned life itself, and the event that I came to was called Making Eco Spirituality Accessible. Why do you want to make eco spirituality accessible?
Well, I mean, I think from our standpoint, basically, I think that a spiritual relationship, when we talk about spirituality or uh, kind of mystical experience, there's a kind of direct connection to things that, okay, if you sit there and wonder at a tree, if we take the kind of view of a tree that inspires poets when they write a beautiful piece of poetry, then they're, in a way, the nature becomes sacred from that standpoint, right? We directly experience the beauty of it, our connection with it, in a way that conceptualization doesn't really add anything to it. Actually, almost always subtracts. And I think that our hyper intellectualized culture has a really hard time connecting with the value of nature, right? In a way that some of the less intellectualized cultures, um, you know, have been more successful at, right? So I mean, I don't see intellectualization as a good or a bad thing. There's this kind of the Western conception of progress is that the more intellectual you get, more progress that is, that has meant essentially distancing ourselves from spiritual traditions, especially mystical traditions, which are, by which I mean the kind of like idea that by coming to something with a total sense of mystery, by giving up um, the giving up our knowledge of something, to coming to something without holding on to a view, but just contemplating it directly without any ideas, that a different kind of knowledge is available through that mindset, through that
Yeah,
approach,
yeah,
which is common in human history. Many kind of people, cultures, tribes, traditions have felt something like that, and it's not part of our mindset right now, right? It isn't that there's if you think it being intellectual is better, you're not doing that, and I think um, you know particularly nature, and the kind of relationship that comes to nature, that we comes to us, naturally with nature when we just kind of stare at it without thinking about it that much, but just really observe, gee, like here we are on this planet. Uh, you know, we need these, we're part of this planet. We come from the ground, basically. We come from the plants, which come from the ground,
yeah, yeah.
uh that's what we're really made of. If you
I,
just
I,
are there
I'm,
with
I'll make a point. I in my masters, I've recently completed a master of business, and I did an independent study unit, which was looking at designing a program to help people connect spiritually to nature called Vita Vantage. I wrote two essays. One was about the Vita hypothesis, and then on the basis of the hypothesis was this program. And I'm repeating this story just to follow up on what you're saying about feeling. As I was writing this up and presenting it to my supervisor, he was saying, "Okay, well that's really great. I love your program that helps people connect spiritually to nature." He says, "But because this is an academic institution, what are the learning outcomes?" And I'm like, well, hold on a minute. I'm trying to get away from learning outcomes. I'm trying to get onto feeling outcomes. But there was no place for feeling outcomes in the academic system in which I was writing this paper, which is, I think, highlights what you're saying, is that we are over intellectualized, that we are hypersensitive to intellectualism, but sort of denuded of feelingism. to give it a name.
Mm,
And that
yeah.
and that
Yeah.
that feeling, if you're open to feeling, then nature and being in the forest and the bee flying past is an extraordinary event. Whereas if you're completely analytical, it's just an annoying insect distracting you from your latest learning.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's something to that. I mean, I suppose you can get fascinated by the insects, but yeah, you kind of need to look at them and be full of awe before
Mm,
you
mm.
can even ask. Yeah, I think
And I think that
I mean, there's so much.
I think there is a very strong synergy between the right amount of intellectualism and the right amount of feeling. I remember a year or so ago, I was sitting working on my computer in front of a TV that was playing some science show, and I looked up and there was a vision of a scuba diver putting a probe into a sponge of all things on the Great Barrier Reef. And then it cut to a laboratory where they were doing genetic analysis of the sponge, and then been able to map out where the sponge fitted into this great big evolutionary tree of life. And I was just sitting there with my jaw was open. I was just stunned. I mean, I've been around sponges. Um, I worked on trawlers actually up in northwestern Australia, and we'd bring sponges up on the deck. They're not very nice, actually. They're really stinky, these big lumpy things that you just got to throw over the side to get to the prawns. So, so there was this sort of intellectual component which actually gave me a deeper reverence of the sponge than the sort of sense that sponges were one of us. Sponges were a part of the ecosystem. Sponges were a part of the life support system of the planet. So, and that's part of the Vita sort of model, is to sort of bring a healthy dose of cerebral activity to uh, 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 synergize with spiritual connection, because spiritual connection without some sort of cerebral connectivity would have people go, oh, I love the forest so much, I'm going to go and buy the green stones. Like, what's the green stones got to do with the forest? Well, nothing necessarily. So the environment, having people spiritually connected to nature, but with an understanding of how it functions through the environmental sciences, I think those two things together are extremely valuable. And obviously, you don't need the intellectualism if you're actually living in the forest, because it's sort of au natural, Although that indigenous wisdom of forests is a form of science in itself, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, you could look at it that way. I mean, everybody's using their brain. Everybody's using their intellect. Every culture, it's
Yeah,
like
yeah.
innate human capacity. As Tyson Yunkaporta, I think from over in your neck of the woods, has been making that point a lot recently, about how developed, say, Australian Aboriginal kind of intellects and intellectual systems really are, to name just one. And I think, yeah, that's absolutely true. It's like, because it's this thing of, when we were talking before, right? I want to just make it clear. It's really the elevation of intellectual over everything else, right? It's
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah,
like thing like that the intellect is good is the problem. It's that actually progress towards systems, progress towards intellectual understanding is kind of, that is synonymous with progress. Not that that's a certain field of progress, and there's kind of like other fields of progress, right? Like where the ability to be able to put this stuff aside and then to look at things anew, like a poet looks at things. That's also another skill, right? And as you say, actually, a quite complementary skill. I mean, obviously, mystery, which is the root word of mysticism, or the root, kind of share, like I say, a root. The root kind of shares a root concept with mysticism, is very helpful for science, right? Because the way that scientists discover something new oftentimes is by looking at something new, forgetting about what they learned already, and looking at something again, and then realizing, oh, actually, what we learned already might not be completely true, right? I mean, that's what James Lovelock was, who I know is the influence of yours, was doing to some extent, was forgetting what he knew and looking at things again, and then he comes away with another scientific view, which is again, very actually leads us to spirituality. And so I think it's that all of these routes to truth kind of support each other, right? That if you take the mystical route to truth and you just sit, you know how to just sit without having any answers, then when an answer comes to you, or when you decide maybe I want an intellectual answer, the kind of answer that comes to you, if you're able to just sit with a direct experience, is kind of a truer one, right? Whereas if you can't get past what you think you know already, uh, you kind of can't let observation data kind of have the importance that they should have,
Yeah.
right? And so, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
Yeah.
part of making eco spirituality accessible, is that people know that we live for a long time, and they know that kind of having cars and medicines is pretty good. And then if we kind of just, some of the eco spiritual strains, maybe even most of them, are a bit like anti technology, a lot of times anti science.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you and I come together on that well, I don't think eco spirituality has to be anti-intellectual, because if we're part of nature, well, these enlarged brains and kind of tools that we come up with are also part of nature. So what we need to do is kind of like have humility about them, and know there, find a place for them that isn't kind of dangerous to the rest of life on Earth.
Yeah, and look, in my searching around and learning
Trying
about,
to disavow them, which
yeah, and in my searching around the New Age spirituality, which New Age spirituality is sort of like anything goes. Basically, it's like a smorgasbord of a little bit of Indian stuff here, a little bit of Buddhism here, a little bit of North American Plains Indians and feathers, and you can do whatever you like within it. And there are these sort of major tropes within it, right? And one of the tropes is that science should just be like the spiritual world and the scientific world are simply not connected in any way. That's a major trope within the New Age spiritual movement, I believe. And I talk to a lot of people, and because I talk about spirituality with a strong scientific component, I often find myself persona non grata in conversations amongst spiritual folk, that they are saying, why is this guy who's talking about spirituality also talking about climate science? And of course, and see, and again, this comes back to this idea that spirituality manifests itself into the real world through the actions and inactions of the believer. Is that if you reject a scientific understanding of the world through your spiritual practice, then you're not going to be paying attention when the scientists are telling we've got a civilizational crisis, that we're overheating the biosphere, and the whole thing's going to end up in a rerun of the Permian extinction if we don't make dramatic change. And so the spiritual movement or industry or sector or whatever you want to call it, the way that I read it, is broadly speaking not helping much in the big picture of trying to arrest the collapse of the global ecosystem. And that's the motivation for my work in the spiritual space, is to try and bring some sort of clarity around earth system issues to people who claim to have spirituality. And now back to Plum Village.
I think we're really that. Hmm.
I think you've frozen. Are you still moving? Okay.
No, I think it should be okay. Yeah, no, I was just saying on that last point, though. I mean, I think yeah, it's important, as you say, that there's something there because people are trying to recover mythology, right? So I think the one thing we don't want to leave out is that the kind of mythical realm of knowledge, thing. There's kind of like the ability to just be there, kind of appreciate the beauty of what is, and then there's kind of analytical knowledge, and then there's this kind of realm of mythology. And I think the difficulty is just to recognize them as see the distinction and also see how they relate to each other. And I think that's actually a rather complicated, rich thing. But what I think in New Age is that okay, there's gotten to be this idea that you have to believe the scientific story or else and that has to dominate your whole mind or else somehow you're I don't know crazy or primitive or whatever, right? And that's kind of different from saying that like science has a particular method and there's these beliefs, scientific beliefs, and we can use them to do stuff. And at the same time, you might have a mythological worldview that can exist right alongside it. And you see that in some, I've heard, I don't know, but a lot of people from Japan or India say that, there's it's a lot more normal there to have kind of like a mythical, understanding and then, scientific understanding and not to really see them as contradictions, but it's kind of
Complementary.
different realms.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because mythology is kind of I don't think we understand it very much because we've actually um, gotten so far into science that we don't really have developed mythologies, but it's kind of like these metaphors for life that are so kind of deep that they're like you can tell you can approach your life through these metaphors that the ancestors have developed and tell every story through a kind of a group of images that have been created or a group of characters that have been created by ancestors that represent all the aspects of reality. It's not really that they're like true; they're more like parts of the imagination that are so apt as metaphors for the way that for the reoccurring difficulties of life that they can help us make sense of life, which is very difficult, different thing, right? And I think that's the thing that New Age people are reacting to is they don't see a space for mythology and they're kind of trying to create one. But what they do is they just reject science to do that, right? And what we need to, what part of I think what the inner work, that um, people in the West can take up is really learning to just give these things their place. Like you can kind of sense when you're in a mythical space. Um, you can sense when you're in a scientific frame, and those two we can kind of just learn to let them exist side by side and not necessarily have to have one or the other be the truth, right? But they're kind of different kinds of truths.
I'm reminded of the cover of Umberto Eco's book, Foucault's Pendulum. And I read it a long time ago, but on the cover it was a picture of Shiva, one of the Hindu gods, and in the background was all of these circles and lines representing breakdown of subatomic particles in a large hadron collider or something. So you've got this sort of ancient religious sort of beliefs in these gods, but with this contemporary deep science of quantum physics all sort of blending in together. And then part of what I remember of the book was this sort of idea that there is this great traditions, these great wisdoms that go back into time, have got sort of insights into things that we're now discovering through science. I don't know to what extent, Hinduism can advise us on subatomic particles, but that's been too literal and didactic, So one of the other things I wanted to talk about, and we got like about 5 minutes left before this thing shuts off. So when I came to Plum Village, I did those 2 trips to Plum Village on the trip to Bergerac. And that was my first real experience of being around, a Buddhist monastery. And I think part of the one thing that sort of struck me about the first time I was there, I was full of objections and questions and didn't really get a lot. But the second time I was there, I had more time to contemplate what it was all about, and it was a really powerful experience for me. The Dharma talk, and then they sang the Heart Sutra song, and then we had the lunch, and But one thing that sort of occurred to me was I was looking at the frog pond. There was a couple of ponds there, and I just remember thinking that there was something odd. There was something wrong about the pond. It was basically a hole in the ground with a black sheet, and then the grass came up to the edge of the sheet. There's a lot of frogs actually in the area that jumped into the pond as I walked towards it. But there was something kind of, it wasn't an ecological planting, as you would say. That pond was not designed by people that had a deep understanding of the ecosystem in order to maximize the biodiversity and life. And that's something I came away from, even in the order of interbeing, the Niktran or Buddhist order, which had a very strong sort of ecological component. Buddhism itself isn't really an ecological spirituality. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would. I don't think it's necessarily an ecological spirituality. I think it can have that, that aspect. But I mean, certainly Zen. There's a lot of nature appreciation in Zen. I mean, these kind of like famous Japanese painting styles of which focus on nature are very inspired, or kind of come out of a Buddhist tradition. The kind of aesthetic behind them um, is very much a part of Buddhism, or I think something that Buddhism lends it to, at least in Japan. But it doesn't have to be. And there's also tradition, right? Like the ponds, reason like a lotus pond is there. I mean, that's something that naturally occurs in say Vietnam, and so then when you try to recreate it to have some type of like link with the tradition which started halfway across the world. So that
Yeah.
temple is in France, and it's has a link from Vietnam, and then people end up planting a lot of stuff from Vietnam. Well, there's also a lot of Vietnamese monks. So there's these bows um, to tradition that might not strike somebody as ecological. It's certainly not an ecolo. It's not like the point of it is to be ecological.
Yeah.
There may be some respect for nature that's kind of ends up being part of it, or that naturally flows out of it, but it's not.
Yeah,
It's
yeah, I
not.
hear. Yeah, I think anytime you place a large body of water, you're going to find that ecology interferes with whatever it was you're planning to do with that body of water, which in this case was
Yeah,
to
if it
have
wasn't there
loads
to
of
begin
flow.
with, it's
Yeah.
probably not ecological. Yeah.
But I'll say one thing. The first time I did the slow walk, I was an impatient man, and I really thought that there was something wrong. I thought that a tree had fallen down at the head of the walk, and that everyone was backed up because that's how slow it was. And eventually, I realized that a slow walk was by definition slow. And so, the next time that I did the slow walk and became more mindful of the experience, I did notice something really powerful, that walking through a forest, um, which obviously there was forests around there that we walked through. Um, Walking at a very slow pace gives you a lot more time to actually observe the trees or observe, the things as they come. Normally, you'd walk at probably four times the pace and you'd skip through it and go, "Oh, that was a nice tree. Might check that out next time I come past." But on the slow walk, you had actually a lot more time to actually take in and absorb the experience. So it's almost like, I guess the point from my perspective is in trying to tease out the really core ecological, spiritual parts of things, is that there was learnings for me in that experience at Plum Village. That's what I'm saying. Even though Plum Village and the whole order of interbeing may not be as uniquely focused on ecological spirituality as the work that I'm doing with Vita Sapien. Valuable nonetheless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, as if people might be interested in Love Letters to the Earth, which is Thich Nhat Hanh's kind of book about loving the earth. Yeah, I think it's an approach where ecological spirituality, I suppose, grows out of a. I mean, the thing is that your breath, right? What's your most basic connection to nature in many ways, like following the breath, which is what Buddhists do a lot, just watching your breath. That's a very natural part of your psyche. It's, basic, it's automatic. It's probably not very different in a rat or, any almost right. And you're just kind of like watching it, your organism in operation. So it's almost like your most basic connection to what it is to be an animal, what it is to be, alive. And that's kind of one of the most core practices at Plum Village is almost to never be out of touch with that, or
Right.
to keep in touch with that.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and there's a kind of, it's interesting just to explore through practice, maybe more so than words, especially since we don't have time for people to explore kind of how uh, of connection to nature evolves naturally out of that practice.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Liam, this is going to shut off in a few seconds. So let's just wrap it up here. Thanks very much for that chat. And let's talk some more about this stuff at a future date.
Yeah, great.
Okay. Good stuff.
Thanks a lot for inviting me on,
Yeah.
Guy.
No
It
worries.
was a
Talk soon.
pleasure as always. See you.
Yeah. Hey, I really hope you like that video. If you like that sort of content, you might help us create some more, social media stuff. Like, share, subscribe, leave a comment, go to the website, and you can subscribe to our newsletter. If you've got resources, we'd love you to donate. There's a link to Patreon. There'll be a link to PayPal. Vita Sapien it's been around. We've been working on this for 6 years. This is now where we're starting to get out into the public and set up a little studio and be able to create what we want eventually is 24-hour programming content that goes out 24 hours a day. We're from small beginnings. We will do something extraordinary. I've got no doubt about that. But we're always at this stage just strapped for cash, scratching around in the dirt like the bush turkeys outside in the forest. So if you can help us in any way, whether it's just by sharing, liking, commenting, but please subscribe to the newsletter so you can get all our content. And if you've got a bit of spare money lying around, then we'd love to have it in our tin so we can do something with it, improve the production quality. There's so many things that we've got planned, all at the moment just constrained by resources. So thank you for being a part of this, and I hope to see you on the next one.